problematic for some people. You know, they think there should be a complete separation between what we call science and what we call religion or spirituality. And many, especially in the world of science and the study of the history of science, have tended to go along with that point of view. However, in recent decades, many historians of science have come to take a different view. For example, there's the famous British historian of science, John Hedley Brooke, and some other historians of science, Margaret J. Osler and J.M. Vandermeer. They were the editors of a volume called Science and Theistic Context. So basically, that's what I'm doing. I'm involved in presenting science in a theistic context, integrating my studies in the ancient Sanskrit writings with scientific evidence. So they point out in their introduction to this work, Science and Theistic Context, they say, when scholars were in the thrall of positivism in its various forms, they emphasized the separateness of science and religion. Today, the history of science is no longer dominated by positivist assumptions. Social, cultural, economic, political, philosophical, and religious factors have all been shown to be intimately connected with the growth, support, and even conceptual development of science. So there are some historians and philosophers of science who are pointing out that religious ideas have been involved in what they call the growth, support, and even conceptual development of science. In their book, Reconstructing Nature, the Engagement of Science and Religion, published by Oxford University Press, John Hedley Brooke and another co-author, Jeffrey Cantor, say the perceived relation between science and religion depends on how both of these terms are defined, when and by whom. They say we must ask, whose science, whose religion? Because there are many types of scientific work and there are many types of religious engagement. So that's why I titled my book, My Science, My Religion, in order to be specific, because we can't talk about religion in a general sense or science in some general sense. And my guru, His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, once said, religion without philosophical basis, without scientific basis, is sentiment. That religion based on philosophy and science, that is right. So there, from his point of view, there should be some integration between what we call religion and what we call science. Albert Einstein said in one of his works, science, please come in. We were expecting a digital projector, but it's delayed, so we're proceeding. And we're talking about my book, My Science, My Religion, which is a collection of 24 papers I've presented at various conferences. And it kind of integrates my Vedic spirituality and my interest in scientific questions related to human origins. So Einstein once famously said, "Science without religion is lame. Religion without science is blind." So in terms of the engagement of science with religion, in terms of the specific tradition that I'm associated with, requires a little bit of background. So from the standpoint of Vedic epistemology, there are various paths for getting knowledge, various categories of evidence. The first being the ascending path of knowledge, and the other being the descending path of knowledge. So the ascending path of knowledge is based on two kinds of evidence. Pratyaksha, which means the evidence that comes to us through our senses, what we can see, what we can hear, what we can touch, what we can measure. And the second type of evidence comes from anumana, what we can logically infer from what we can observe and measure. So modern science is basically taking the ascending path of knowledge, and it's based on pratyaksha, sense evidence, and logical inference, anumana. Now, according to the Vedic epistemology, there are some limitations there because the senses by which we acquire knowledge about the world are limited and imperfect. And the mind that we use for logical inference also has its imperfections. It's subjected to mistakes, illusion, cheating. There are different limitations to the anumana, or logical inference process. Now, according to the Vedic epistemology, however, there's another path of knowledge, the descending path of knowledge, that relies not simply on pratyaksha and anumana, sense evidence and logical inference, but shabda pramana, testimony. And by testimony, in this particular instance, is meant testimony coming from a higher conscious, intelligent source. According to the Vedic epistemology, ultimately, there is a supreme, conscious, intelligent being who is the source of everything, and that intelligent, conscious source of everything is capable of communicating knowledge in the form of transcendental sound, ultimately. Shabda means sound in Sanskrit. So that sound vibration can be recorded in literary form, and this particularly in the form of the Vedic text. And that constitutes a kind of evidence. Now, of course, in the modern context, statements from text, Vedic text, like the Puranas, which I particularly focus on, the historical and cosmological writings of ancient India. You know, I cannot walk into a meeting of the World Archaeological Congress and give a statement from the Puranas and accept and expect those gathered there to take that as evidence. They would want to know, what do you have in terms of pratyaksha, actual sense evidence, discoveries of stones, bones, artifacts, and the logical inferences that can be drawn from them. So, one of the teachers in the line that I belong to, Bhaktivinoda Thakur, who lived in the 19th century, said in his work, if knowledge acquired through the evidences of pratyaksha, anumana, etc. correspond with the perfect teachings of the Vedas, then of course we are duty-bound to accept such evidences. And he proposed that one could use pratyaksha and anumana, sense evidence and logic, to support the statements from the Shabda Pramana, from sacred revelation or testimony. And basically, that's what I do in my work. So that's how I'm integrating my religion with my science, with my spirituality with my science. I'm looking at pratyaksha and anumana, and I'm looking at the evidence that comes from the Shabda Pramana, testimony, and trying to integrate them. So, in this book, when I say my science, I mean scientific evidence and logic consistent with the Vedic conclusions. And by my religion, I mean the Vedic conclusions as I have received them from the disciplic line to which I belong. So, this book, My Science, My Religion, as I said, contains 24 papers that I've presented at major international scientific conferences and academic gatherings, integrating my Vedic spiritual sources of knowledge with the knowledge that I've acquired in the disciplines of archaeology and other disciplines. So I deal with a lot of different topics in my work. One of them is human antiquity. How long has the human species been present on this planet? According to most scientists today, the modern followers of Charles Darwin, the first humans like us appeared on Earth less than 200,000 years ago. That's the now dominant concept. And before that, the supporters of those ideas would say there were no humans like us present on Earth. There were only more primitive ape-like human ancestors. Now, the Puranas, the historical writings of ancient India, say humans have been present for vastly longer periods of time than that, actually going all the way back to the very beginnings of the history of life on Earth. And I'll just give an example, from the Puranas. In the Bhagavad Purana, 6th canto, chapter 4, text 1, we read a statement. I could read the Sanskrit for you, but I'll just give the English translation. The demigods, demons, human beings, nagas, beasts, and birds were created during the reign of Swayambhuva Manu. Now, to understand what that means, we have to know something about the Vedic concept of time. So, we do have a projector here now.
So we'll just pause for a minute. Sorry for interruption. And we'll just project. So I think I'll just move this.
Well, you want to put it up there, or you want to put it on one of these walls?
If you can move this, I think we can just project here.
Can everybody see up there? There's some more chairs here if anybody needs one. There's a gentleman back there. Here you go. I don't need one. There you go.
Just one.
Pointed further to the left.
Yeah, see, this is slanted that way. You have to turn it this way some. The whole machine. Move the whole machine.
Yeah.
Like that.
And from this.
Yeah, that's good. Oops, slip down a little bit. Okay. So, we're talking about the Vedic idea of extreme human antiquity, and I had just read a Sanskrit text saying human beings were present during the reign of Swayambhuva Manu. So to understand the significance of a statement like that, we have to know something about the Vedic concept of time. The basic unit of Vedic cyclical time is called the Kalpa, or the day of Brahma. It lasts about 4,320,000,000 years. It's followed by a night of Brahma that lasts the same amount of time, and then there's another day, another night. Cycles go on endlessly. And during the nights of Brahma, life in the universe is dormant, and during the days of Brahma, life, including human life, is manifest. Now, the Kalpa, or the day of Brahma, is divided into 14 sub-periods called manvantars, each ruled by a Manu, personality called a Manu. According to the Vedic cosmological calendar, we are now in the 7th, or Vaivasvata Manvantar period, and the Swayambhuva Manvantar period is the first one. It goes back to about 1.7 to 2 billion years ago. So, according to the Puranas, humans have been present on Earth continuously since that time. So, of course, if I go to a meeting of the European Association of Archaeologists or a meeting of the World Archaeological Congress, I can't expect archaeologists to take a statement from the Puranas as evidence that humans have been present on Earth vastly longer than the 200,000 years most of them now accept. What I can do is make a prediction. Namely, if what the Puranas say is true, there should be reports of archaeological evidence for humans existing much further back in time than 150,000 or 200,000 years ago, perhaps going back many millions of years. So, my methodology for testing that prediction was to examine all archaeological reports from the time of Darwin to the present. It took me about 8 years to do that when I was engaged in that project. And I have two principal findings. I divide the scientific literature into two parts, the primary and secondary scientific literature. By primary scientific literature, I mean original reports by archaeologists, paleontologists, geologists, other earth scientists, published in their professional peer-reviewed scientific journals. And by secondary literature, I mean textbooks, survey studies, books that are based on the primary literature. So my first finding is not too surprising. There are no reports of evidence for extreme human antiquity in the current secondary literature textbooks. My second finding was a little more interesting, at least to me, and it is that there are many reports of evidence for extreme human antiquity in the primary literature, past and present. And I collected those reports in this book, Forbidden Archaeology. It's about 900 pages long. And the question arises, if this body of evidence is there, if there are reports of evidence for extreme human antiquity in the primary scientific literature, why isn't it included in the current secondary literature, textbooks, for example? I've proposed that it's because of what I call a process of knowledge filtration that operates in the world of science. And I guess that's where the title knowledge filtration in academia came from. That was the title of some of the announcements of this lecture. And here I'm not talking about a satanic conspiracy to suppress truth. I'm talking about something that historians of science and philosophers of science have understood for a long time, namely that theoretical preconceptions can influence how scientists in a particular discipline will relate to different categories of evidence that come to their attention. We can call the blue box there the knowledge filter, and we can say that what it represents is the dominant consensus in a discipline about some particular question. And reports of evidence that conform to the dominant consensus will tend to pass through this intellectual filter very easily. But reports of evidence that radically contradict the dominant consensus tend to be filtered out, set aside, forgotten, ignored. And I'm going to give an example of the kind of evidence that I'm talking about and how the knowledge filtering process operated in a particular case. In the 19th century, gold was discovered in California, and miners came here to get the gold, and they came to places like Table Mountain in Tuolumne County in the Sierra Nevada mountains near Sonora. And they dug tunnels into the sides of mountains to get at the gold-bearing deposits. And deep inside those tunnels in the solid rock, the miners found human bones and human artifacts. For example, they found many stone mortars and pestles like this example, and obsidian spear points and other kinds of stone tools and weapons, in addition to finding human bones. Now, what makes these discoveries so interesting to me is they were found in layers of solid rock that modern geologists tell us belong to the early part of the Eocene period, which means they'd be about 50 million years old. These discoveries were originally reported to the scientific world by Dr. J.D. Whitney, who was the chief government geologist of California. His report was published by Harvard University's Museum of Comparative Zoology in 1879. But we don't hear very much about these discoveries today because of the process of knowledge filtration I mentioned. This is the anthropologist William Holmes, who worked at the Smithsonian Institution, and he said, if Dr. Whitney had understood the theory of human evolution, he would not have published those findings, notwithstanding the imposing array of testimony with which he was confronted. In other words, if the reported facts contradicted the dominant theory, they should be forgotten. And basically, that's what happened. However, some of the artifacts from the California gold mines are in the collection of the Phoebe Hearst Museum of Anthropology at the University of California at Berkeley. They're not displayed to the public, but I got permission from the directors of the museum to see them. They're kept in a storage building several miles from the museum, but they are still there, and these are some of the artifacts from the Eocene deposits at Table Mountain. And I also studied Dr. Whitney's original field notes and maps. And I went to the Sierra Nevada mountains. This is Table Mountain as it looks today. And we were able to find some of the old 19th century gold mining tunnels where these objects were originally discovered. So that's just one example of the many hundreds of reports of archaeological evidence for extreme human antiquity that I documented in my book, Forbidden Archaeology. And the significance of this evidence to me is it's consistent with what the Puranas, the Vedic historical texts, say about human origins and antiquity. So after the book was published, I began presenting papers about the topic of the book at archaeological conferences, such as the meeting of the World Archaeological Congress that was held in New Delhi in 1994. That was the first time I presented a paper at a conference like that. And the World Archaeological Congress is one of the world's largest international organizations of archaeologists. It meets every 4 years in a different country around the world. And I thought, since they were meeting in India that year, that would be a good place to present something. And I saw that there was a section in the conference on time and archaeology. So I proposed a paper called Puranic Time and the Archaeological Record. It was accepted. And I went to Delhi and presented the paper, and it was later published in one of the peer-reviewed conference proceedings volumes from that Congress, Time and Archaeology. It came out from Routledge, an academic and scientific publisher. So, since that time, I've presented 13 further papers at archaeological conferences on archaeological evidence consistent with the Puranic accounts of extreme human antiquity. And, including the Delhi paper, that's 13 papers, and the text of those papers are included in this book, My Science, My Religion. Now, another related topic that I deal with is what is the origin of humans and human consciousness? Today, many scientists, modern followers of Charles Darwin, will say that really we are machines made of molecules, and somehow or other, by some kind of cosmic accident on this planet, which is rotating around one of the many millions of billions of stars in this galaxy, molecules happen to combine together to form some first self-reproducing molecular biological organism, which somehow or other developed into human form. And not only are we told, are we machines made of molecules, we're machines made of molecules in competition with each other for survival. As Richard Dawkins colorfully put it, we are survival machines, robot vehicles blindly programmed to preserve the selfish molecules known as genes. And as far as our consciousness is concerned, many today will say, well, consciousness is produced by brain chemistry, but only temporarily and only in association with the brain. And at the time of death, when the molecules in the brain become disorganized, no more consciousness. The Vedic texts, like Bhagavad Gita, give a different explanation of where we have come from as conscious beings. In the Bhagavad Gita, we read Mamaidam so jiva loke jiva bhuta sanatana manasashtan indriyani prakritishtani karshati. an English translation of that. The living entities in this conditioned world are, says Lord Krishna, my eternal fragmental parts. Due to conditioned life, they are struggling very hard with the six senses, which include the mind. In his commentary on that text, my guru said, every living entity as an individual soul has his personal individuality and a minute form of independence. By misuse of that independence, one becomes a conditioned soul. The conditioned soul is covered by the material body with the mind and senses, and when he is liberated, this material covering perishes, but his spiritual body manifests itself in its individual capacity. So what can we gather from such statements? We are originally conscious, eternal beings, souls, if you will, that having come down from that position are now covered by the subtle material mind and the gross material body, made of senses. In other words, consciousness is not produced by matter. Consciousness has its own independent existence apart from matter, but it can come into association with matter, which is our current condition. So I try to explain this in terms of the evidence that's available from modern science in this book, Human Devolution, a Vedic Alternative to Darwin's Theory. And basically what I propose in that book is that before we even ask where human beings come from, we should first of all ask, what is a human being? As I said, many scientists today are going to say we're just machines made of matter, machines made of molecules. And as far as mind and consciousness are concerned, well, they are the result of bioelectrical activity in the brain. They don't have any independent